Probably Leo XIII's most famous encyclical is Rerum Novarum on the rights and duties of capital and labour, which was issued in 1891 and which was commemorated by many subsequent papal documents, among the most famous of which was Centesimus Annus, 100 years later, issued by John Paul II in the wake of the collapse of communism. The great enemy, or at least one of the great enemies, probably the principal, of Leo's teaching on economic matters being, of course, socialism and communism. And Leo, in fact, turned to the refutation of socialism in the same year as he was elected Pope, 1878, in the encyclical Quod Apostolici Muneris, which is the encyclical which comes immediately before Rerum Novarum in his sequence of 9 encyclicals. They are the 7th and the 8th of the 9 principal acts of his pontificate in the list he produced in 1902. Obviously, the main elements of his teaching against socialism is contained in Rerum Novarum, so we can consider that teaching as a block. The Church is also unhappy with capitalism. This is something which many Catholics who are more conservative find difficult to swallow. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus says he considers the question if communism and socialism have been refuted by the horrors of the 20th century, which people naively thought they had been in the early 1990s. We know better now. Then is the answer instead to embrace capitalism? And he says, well, no, not really. Well, what he says is, if by capitalism you mean a free market in which people are able to exchange goods and services, and the right of private property is guaranteed by the law, and people are able to flourish and pursue their talents within a framework which upholds natural justice, then yes, but it would be better to call that a market economy or a free economy rather than capitalism. If, on the other hand, you mean a society in which ownership becomes confined to smaller and smaller groups, individuals and organizations, and people are left dependent upon them, then no, that wouldn't be preferable. And in fact, in some ways, the Church's critique of capitalism in the bad sense is a good way into understanding the Church's critique of socialism, because looked at from the perspective of Leo XIII, socialism is just a particularly grotesque and inefficient form of capitalism. He says in Rerum Novarum, over the course of time it has come to pass that working men have been surrendered, isolated and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. The mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the Church, is nevertheless under a different guise, but with the like injustice still practised by covetous and grasping men. The conduct of trade and the hiring of labour have become concentrated in the hands of comparatively few, so that a small number of extremely rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the labouring poor a yoke little better than slavery itself. This is a brilliant summary of his critique of the form of economic and organisation which he encountered in his own day and which still exists with us today. What's the problem then? First of all, we need to understand a doctrine called the universal destination of goods. God made the entire earth, the material creation, for the benefit of man. He handed it over to man to guard and to keep, to provide for the material needs of the entire human race. And it was given to the entire human race communally. However, in order to render the earth fruitful, able to provide for man, it is necessary for man to apply to it his labour, all the more so since the curse of the fall fell upon it. Now, this labour renders the earth fruitful, and it causes man to acquire, an individual man, to acquire responsibility for that part of the material creation to which he applied his labour. That then becomes his property, that which is proper to him, and he is obliged to provide for his own material needs and those of those who are dependent upon him from that part of the material creation which he has appropriated to him through his labour. That is, of course, in the first case, his family, his spouse, and his children. Now, this is the origin of property. but it doesn't eradicate the universal destination of goods. That is, it doesn't eradicate the purpose of the earth in providing for the entire human race. So when man acquires property over the earth, that property takes the form of the 4 S's, a construct which is my own invention, but which you will find if you read through Rerum Novarum. The first S is subsistence. That is, he needs to literally provide for the shelter, food, clothing, etc. of himself, his wife, and his family. The second S is security. That is, he needs to provide enough additional food or equivalent resources in the form of currency or whatever, other additional clothes, materials to repair the building in which he shelters, etc., so that if his ability to provide these things immediately is taken away from him because of a famine or a hurricane or a war or whatever, that he's able to guard against any such difficulty. So subsistence, security. The third S is savings. Now, why do we need savings? Well, when man first interacts with an uninhabited part of the earth, terra nullius, no man's land, this is a concept which was abused in the colonial period, but which is a real concept in itself. He settles an island that no one's ever been to before, then he simply applies his labour to that soil and acquires a natural right of property over that soil. But of course, the entire earth is now divided up between the nations of the world, and almost everywhere is inhabited. The result is your chances of finding any terra nullius are very slim, so you're probably in the first instance, unless you inherit property from your parents, which is a perfectly natural thing to do, but if you don't do that, then you will probably begin your acquisition of property by labouring on somebody else's property, and they will remunerate you for doing so. So that remuneration must be such that if you're working full-time for them, this is where the doctrine of a just wage arises, if you're working full-time for them, then it is enough to provide for subsistence, security and savings. Because if it isn't, then you're receiving less than what is naturally just for your labour. Now, the reason why you need the savings is because it is less natural, it's not unnatural, but it's less natural for you to be working on somebody else's property, somebody else's land, than it is for you to be working on your own land, or in more modern technological terms, to be working by exploiting somebody else's means of production rather than owning your own means of production. So you should earn enough to ultimately purchase your own means of production. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to own your own homestead. That's a very edifying and good thing to do, but it might be that you buy shares in joint stock companies instead. That's also perfectly legitimate. In a way, pensions represent a form of ownership of the means of production, albeit it's not usually your own means of production. But so savings, because they allow you to return to the ownership of the means of production, they are a natural form of property that should be contained within a just wage. The fourth S is surplus. Either because you're lucky, or because you work particularly hard, or because you're particularly clever, you may end up with surplus. That is more than you need for your subsistence, more than you need for your security, more than you need for your savings. You may end up with the ability to acquire luxuries or sit on great big piles of gold without doing anything. Now, this fourth element in property, which of course needs to be defended by the state against theft, and which the state is not permitted to simply appropriate, although the state has the right to levy taxes to fund its proper duties, it doesn't have the right to levy taxes or appropriate property simply because it doesn't like the way property has ended up being distributed. That would be a violation of its duty to defend the right of property. But if you have this surplus wealth, that is a danger to you. As St. James points out in his epistle, it will drag you down to hell, because if you have surplus wealth, that means it's not providing for somebody else's subsistence, security and savings, which means that you're withholding it from them, because it was given to the human race to provide for the subsistence and security of the human race. So if you're keeping it and other people do not have subsistence and security, then you are withholding it from those who should possess it. So it becomes sinful. However, there's an easy way to solve this that doesn't involve the state getting involved, and that is that you can give it away, of course. You can give it away charitably, but that isn't necessarily the best thing to do. That's a perfectly good thing to do, and you should always be doing that, but that's not necessarily the best way. You could also give it to your children to set them up in business, and in fact, according to the principles of Catholic social teaching, inheritance tax is an unjust tax because the family is the basic unit of society, as we've discussed, not the individual, and therefore the transmission of property within the family is not a transaction which the state justly taxes. But the third thing you could do is simply to employ more people, found more businesses, cultivate more fields, open more car factories or whatever it is, and pay those people just wages so that they receive subsistence, security and savings. So you will, of course, because you work hard and are intelligent, no doubt become even richer through doing this. That in itself is fine, so long as you get rid of the surplus by giving it away, bequeathing it to your children, or even better, employing more people so that they can provide for their families. So you can legitimately, as a good Catholic, become richer and richer and richer, so long as you constantly use those riches to help more and more people provide for themselves and for their families. If, however, you decide to just invest in huge numbers of expensive Swiss watches, a little bit of cocaine, and 25 Lamborghinis, then I'm afraid it's straight down when you die. So avoid doing that. Now, as Leo indicates in the passage that we quoted earlier, the distortions of surplus can become very serious, and one of the ways in which they become very serious is through the sin of usury, as Leo says. Now, usury is a special form of lending money. It's not any lending of money. It's not any lending of money at interest. It's lending money at interest in which any collateral offered by the borrower is not the full extent of the borrower's liability. That is, it's lending money interest where you can pursue the debtor to the end. You can ultimately enslave him if he fails to pay you back for what he borrowed plus interest. Now, slavery is not absolutely per se contrary to the natural law. It's a bit like a military dictatorship or a plutocratic oligarchy. Though it's worse. It's a terribly bad, stupid idea that's a massive occasion of sin. But the ownership of one person's labour by another is not in itself contrary to the natural law. Otherwise, paid employment, prisoner of war camps would all be intrinsically tyrannical. But slavery is the least desirable form of economic organisation. And just as it's a good thing to specify which side of the road you should drive on so people don't constantly crash head-on into each other, so it's a very good thing to simply forbid slavery in order to prevent that form of economic organisation occurring in your society. Usury is a wicked thing precisely because it's a way of surreptitiously enslaving someone. A good illustration of the wickedness of usury is if you imagine three men sitting in a room and each of them has $100 and each of them lends $100 to the person to their left at 10% rate of interest in a usurious way where the liability of the borrower is not limited by the collateral which the borrower offers, then, and if you're living in a society where usury is purportedly legal, that means the courts will enforce these loan agreements. That means that there are now $330 in the room because the courts will enforce the loan agreements for the 10% rate of interest, whereas there used to be only $300 in the room. Now, this essentially means that these three private individuals were empowered by the state to generate $30 out of nothing. Now, a currency is worth all the goods available for a consideration within the jurisdiction issuing the currency divided by the number of units in circulation. So if usury is legal, then those three individuals have marginally increased the number of units in circulation and therefore marginally diminished the value of every other unit in circulation. and thereby stolen from everybody who is unable to lend money at interest. Well, in fact, they've stolen even from the people who are able to lend money at interest. What they've done is stolen from everyone who owns a unit of that currency in a tiny fractional way. The result is that once you legalize usury, concentrations of wealth will start to accumulate by themselves in a natural law market, as John Paul II described. Wealth will be attracted to hard work and intelligent work, whereas in a usurious market, wealth will be attracted to pre-existing concentrations of wealth. And the eventual consequence of that will be that nobody will be able to own their own means of production. Unless you already have enough resources to lend out money usuriously, you will be forced to be forever the employee of another person who owns your means of production. And society will be divided into the teeming masses of the labouring poor, reduced to a condition little better than slavery itself, as Leo XIII says, and a small number of exceedingly rich men. This is what causes the disorders of capitalist society. Whereas what we need is a truly free market. Now, you can still lend money in such a market, and you can lend money at interest, but it must be limited by the collateral offered by the borrower, because then the lender is buying a real stake in a real piece of property and is not inventing value from nothing and thereby diminishing the value of all the currency in the possession of those who are poorer than themselves. How does this lead into socialism? Well, Leo explains that the socialist, working upon the poor man's envy of the rich, in Leo's words, suggests resolving the problem by seizing control of all property into the hands of the state, and the state can then ensure that everybody gets what they need, that they get their subsistence, their security, and they don't need their savings because all of that is possessed by the benign state. But in fact, what that is just a grotesquely inefficient, massive form of the disordered capitalist arrangement that Leo is complaining about. You end up with everybody in the state employed by the state and essentially a slave of the state. So at least capitalist economies of the free market kind are hyper efficient and produce the goods which they want to produce extremely well, so that especially if you're living in a country where the owners of property also reside, you will at least be able to work as a servant of theirs or a servant of their servants and live at a reasonable standard of living. Perhaps if you're in a sweatshop somewhere else, things are not quite so good for you. But in a communist or vigorously socialist society, you will find that you're working for an unbelievably inefficient capitalist company which is unable to even produce basic goods, as everyone who's ever lived in a communist country discovers, because with no competitors, it has no incentive to improve its performance. And of course, in communist countries where this unification of all property under the state was brought about through violence, it will probably be people running that society who are skilled at putting bombs underneath railway carriages or seizing control of railway stations and post offices and killing monarchs who end up running that society rather than people who are good at producing motor cars and aeroplanes and nylon stockings. So the result is you'll be being ruled by murderers and starving to death in an incredibly inefficient capitalist monopoly. That is essentially what a communist society is. So the church is very much committed to, and the tradition of Western thought, the perennial philosophy, is very much committed to a non-usurious, truly free market in which people are able to labour for remuneration, to provide for their families, and ultimately to own a share in the means of production in general, or even preferably their own means of production through some form of cooperative ownership. And this is the model which the church lays out, and which tends towards the provision for the needs of people in a society and towards their perfection in virtue as providers for and carers after their family.